Public test builds, or PTBs, are game builds specifically for testing upcoming releases of Dead by Daylight content. As a result, much of the content on these builds is experimental or unfinished, leading to some insane moments over the years, both positive and negative. Today we're going to look at those varied moments. Hey everyone, and let's get started. To start out, we go all the way back to the beginning of year 3, with the 3.0.0 PTB, which introduced the Ghostface for the game's 3-year anniversary, and despite the content itself being pretty cool, it had a whole lot of problems. It also wasn't helped by the fact that Ghosty and his perks had been completely leaked before any of it came out. Ghosty's power was not very refined at this point, and so his reveal mechanic was especially sensitive, to the point where you could apparently spin in a circle, and if you saw Ghostface for even a second, he would be pulled out of Night Shroud. There were further issues with things like his leaning and his ability to stalk registering when looking at survivors. Other odd parts to this update were additions to palettes, with VFX being added when a killer was stunned. These were largely disliked and said to be quite unnecessary and disorienting to face. This patch also contained a large survivor nerf, finally removing fast vaults when too close to a window, and further making it so when a survivor looked around, their head would visibly move. Alongside this were changes to Metal of Man, nerfing it quite a bit, which wasn't received too well by survivor mains seemingly. The 4.1.0 PTB was a shocking one because of the changes to Billy, this being the start of a long period of pain for the character, with him only truly ever reverting back to something similar to his pre-4.1.0 state in the later 7.5.0 update. In this patch, Billy received a number of substantial nerfs, removing most of the things that made him good. He got a punishing overheat mechanic on his chainsaw, and a number of nerfs to his add-ons. The insane backlash to these changes is something I've never seen to such a degree. Even to this point nowadays, I don't think I've seen that much backlash for a change. People really did not like how Billy was being altered, with many claiming it took away his skill expression and any sense of fun by simply restricting him and his power. That's personally why I think the current overdrive is so good. It just flips that concept and instead made it rewarding to use and interact with the chainsaw. The 4.4.0 PTB introduced the twins and Elodie for the A Binding of Kin chapter. This was probably one of the worst PTBs and subsequent content releases the game has ever seen. This was a pretty bad PTB in terms of the state of release and presentation of the content, a bad impression that has never quite been shaken for the twins. The PTB was loaded with bugs and many issues with how the twins and their power functioned, with it in many ways barely functioning. One of the core issues with them was Victor. There were other clearly overlooked parts of their design too, such as Victor not being able to do anything at all if someone climbed into a locker. Victor couldn't pin or hold them into the locker like he can now, he would just be completely countered. These were all defining factors of the PTB, as well as things like some perks not working or doing anything at all. In fact, the PTB had a whole plethora of issues. It was an overall bad state for a PTB, and the game as a whole, and quite likely the worst release and PTB for the game. It was received with disappointment for what could have been. The 4.5.0 PTB was a significant moment in Dead by Daylight history because it introduced one of the biggest changes to the game, which at surface level might not seem like such a big deal. To an outsider, it may even seem like more of a positive than a negative. This update included an alteration to both the UI and HUD layout in-game, as well as an alteration to the movement of survivors. Not only this, but much of the movement was changed, altering it to be, well, different. This was big at the time, however, as the movement up till this point had been pretty much unchanged and was considered a key and core part of gameplay and how DBD visually looked. The survivors used to run with a different posture, leaning forward more and being sort of hunched over. Looking back, and to be honest, it does look a little strange. The movement in this PTB did feel very clunky despite it being an overall visual improvement, which was more so the issue. I remember parts of movement such as spins and making sharp turns in general were affected by these changes, and movement as a whole felt quite clunky. The other big part was the UI and the HUD. For whatever reason, they decided to spread it across all corners of the screen, which was visually very confusing and just quite messy, and over a few patches, this was slowly changed into how we know it now. The 5.0.0 PTB was for the 5-year anniversary of the game, and introduced the Resident Evil chapter. This PTB was sort of good evidence for PC PC PTBs not always being a sure way to test for the entire game. This PTB was rough at the time due to the bugs mainly with both the map, the Raccoon City Police Department, and the Nemesis's zombies, which acted just like zombies, I suppose. The RPD upon release was much bigger than the version we have in game, where RPD has two variants. The old RPD was one much larger variant that contained all of the area from the current two maps. This was a big problem for consoles upon release, and something this PTB couldn't really pick up on, I guess, with it only being on PC. RPD would go on to be disabled upon the release day of the chapter, and remain this way for a while longer. Even long after this, I had reports from viewers of problems persisting ever since this release on consoles. Performance issues and crashes mostly. It's a shame, and it does seem to be a result of these things not being possible to test on consoles, with it only being for PC. So whilst this PTB was mostly fine, I think, the true issues that seem to come along with it, but flew under the radar, outline it to me as a pretty insane PTB. The 5.3.0 PTB introduced Michaela Reed, and at the time brand new boon perks. The boons being the true problematic and chaotic element of the PTB. Original Boon's Circle of Healing had a very powerful effect, and allowed for a 100% boost to healing speeds, and the ability to self-heal, so long as you were in its radius. Back then though, the boon radius was not 24 meters, but instead 28 meters. This was a critical difference because it meant you could actually overlap the boons in some cases, creating very powerful effects. There were some maps which enabled healing at a considerably fast pace, due to the ability to overlap these boons. The response to this was to nerf the boon radius down to 24 meters, and later altering the heal speeds to 75% soon after it came to life, and also cutting out the overlap effect. At the time, the chaos of boons was a pretty big deal, with it being the first new perk type to be introduced in quite some time, and appearing to be potentially the most broken perk the Survivor side had ever gotten. The 6.1.0 PTB was insane, and partly down to it having one of the biggest perk overhauls in the game's history, shaking the meta up substantially. This was insane in more of a good way, or some may say a bad way. Overall, it introduced just a ton of things to play around with, and a large meta shift. It also altered things like generator speeds, and faster generator kicks and pallet breaks for killers. This patch was also the introduction of base kit borrowed time, where prior you pretty much had to run the perk, or you or a teammate would be much more vulnerable to tunneling. This was a big deal, to be honest, and freed up a whole perk slot for most people. To this day, I think this is still the largest amount of changes, especially to perks, to happen all in one go, with a total of over 40 perks being altered in this patch. The 6.3.0 PTB was one of the most interesting PTBs of recent memory, with it including some very big changes that never made it to the live game. This PTB contained some mild madness due to it containing a new system for Moris known as the Finisher Mori system. This PTB changed Moris entirely, with them being removed from the game in the way we currently know. Instead, each of the Mori offerings was altered to give you a blood point reward upon killing a certain amount of survivors with a Finisher Mori. To activate this Mori, you had to down all players. Once this was done, a Mori cutscene would play and the game would end. This could happen so long as all players were in the dying state. Together, these changes seem to just encourage slugging, despite this update actually trying to actively stop it. This was incentivized with the new inbuilt Unbreakable, when in the dying state you would be able to fully recover over the course of 45 seconds. So whilst it was hard to down people in this time frame, it was entirely possible, especially if you were playing a character like Nurse. One of the worst parts of this PTB though was the alterations to many of the perks that affected you in the dying state and altered recovery times. Overall, I do not think these were good changes, although many likely being placeholders, because they sort of gutted the heart of many of the perks, taking away what made them cool or unique in the first place. It left them only with the bonus numbers and percentage additions that ultimately just feels pretty empty. Overall, this PTB was pretty crazy, but did not make it to live, and was not intended to come to live in this format either. Years later, and it seems to have been completely scrapped, which is probably for the best. It was a novel idea and an interesting thing to explore for a PTB. The 6.7.0 PTB was an interesting one overall, with mostly good changes, but with some some really mind-blowing alterations to how healing worked. Healing received a number of nerfs, which caused heals as a whole to take a very long time, no matter what methods you were healing through. Medkits were practically destroyed in their changes, with all of the charge numbers being normalized, and heal speed only becoming slightly different. This on top of a nerf to pretty much all of the medkit add-ons too. There were also big steps to remove certain interactions surrounding flashlights. Wraith and Nurse no longer could be stunned with a flashlight when using their powers, and Hag's traps couldn't be broken. This along with a bunch of map and killer changes. A pretty big but chaotic update that got a lot of feedback for sure. The 7.5.0 PTB was incredible and some of the most fun I've had on a PTB. This had the Billy Overdrive rework. This was a nice return to form and one of the coolest PTBs, with everyone happy about the Billy changes and zooming around with the brand new chainsaw. Yeah, that's it. We now reach the 7.7.0 PTB, the reason for this video and sort of a current day plea to not have these changes go live. This PTB contains many changes, with the primary one being a rework to the twins, which has taken them in a very problematic direction, with them shooting up to the top spots of a tier list. This PTB made it so Victor no longer attaches onto healthy survivors like he used to. Alternately, he is now able to attach onto survivors who are injured. Not only this, but now Victor gets an immunity window after a non-lethal hit, meaning in theory he can dart between all 4 survivors, injuring them all and also downing one with literally zero consequence, so long as you don't miss of course, but that's quite hard with Victor's great speed and accuracy. And the only thing that's going to stop you is the strange bugs and invisible walls that seem to be just about everywhere. Twins suddenly becoming one of the strongest characters in the game is a surprise for sure, and not really a welcome one. They secured this spot even more so in this PTB due to Blight having some of his techs removed, which allow him to slide off of surfaces, this being a large part for many to truly master him, and making him even more powerful. This PTB is further full of many strange bugs and glitches like T-posing with Dead Hard, and the new store preview screens playing bugged animations. This was likely a result of the game's upgrade to Unreal Engine 5, a needed change, but one that will likely result in some turbulence. I hope you enjoyed this brief look back at some of the most interesting PTBs in Dead by Daylight's history. If there's any others you think are worth mentioning, let me know down below.